CAA number 3 Historical Timeline, and our group members are
Caitlin McCann,
Michelle Mejia,
and Holly Madrid.
The first slide that we have is Brown versus Board of Education that took place in 1954. The key points of this court decision introduced integration into public schools. The states are to provide students with equal educational opportunities, and the states determine the language of instruction for schools, while the parents are responsible for organizing after-school classes and the little organizations afterwards. The implications for this case is that it paved the way for high-quality bilingual programs, and the court ruled it unlawful under Amendment 14 to discriminate against any group of people. Limitations: in the beginning, this case was only towards African American students, so it wasn't applied until later to students with disabilities. So it didn't happen right away for them like it should have.
Our next slide that we have is the Title VII Bilingual Act, or ELLS, and it was brought about in 1968. Its key points is that the act established the federal policy for bilingual education, primarily for economically disadvantaged language minority students. It distributed funds for innovative programs, and it also recognized the educational disadvantages that are faced by English language learners, as well as non-English speaking students. The implications that we have with it is that it later broadened to include students from a wider range of economic groups, so it wasn't as limited. But the limitations that it had was whenever it was first introduced, it only favored school districts with high percentages of students from low-income families, so it didn't support the English language and emergent bilinguals as much.
Section 504, Vocational Rehabilitation Act, 1973, protects against segregation or exclusion of students with disabilities. Students with disabilities must be given the same opportunities to participate in academic, non-academic, and extracurricular activities as their non-disabled peers. This law applies to public elementary and secondary schools, as well as other education entities. A student who uses a wheelchair but who has no neurological impairment is a good example of a student who may best benefit from their education under the provisions of Section 504. Implications: protect students with disabilities from being discriminated, which applies to employers and organizations. This act also accommodates special education students' needs academically and physically in public schools. Limitations: yes, the Section 504 Act protects students with disabilities, but not all students with disabilities, unfortunately. Some students with disabilities only qualify for Section 504 services, accommodations only, and some students qualify for services through an IEP, accommodations, and/or modifications to curriculum.
Lau versus Nichols took place in 1974. The key points of this case is that it's one of the most important regarding ELL education, and that it did away with the sink or swim. Chinese American students were being placed into general classrooms even though they lacked proficiency in English. The implications of this case would be the Lau remedies. Districts had to implement bilingual education programs for ELLs. It codified into federal law through the Equal Educational Opportunities Act of 1974. And schools must provide bilingual education for elementary students. Limitations: it received little public recognition in the New York Times when it was first going on, and it did not invoke constitutional guarantees or legal parlance.
Castaneda versus Pickard in 1981. Key points are it mandates that ELO programs should be based on a sound educational theory. It implemented effectively with sufficient resources and personnel. It evaluated to determine whether they are effective in helping students overcome language barriers. Its implications are the major outcome of this case is a three-pronged test to determine whether schools are taking appropriate action to address the needs of ELLs. Its limitations are the right to bilingual education was negatively affected from this case because the Raymondville School District fell far short of meeting requirements of the EEOA, Equal Educational Opportunities Act. The court did not support the plaintiff's demands for bilingual education.
Proposition 227 took place in 1998. The key points, excluding San Francisco and San Jose, other districts were forced to eliminate bilingual programs. It restricted the use of primary language for instructing English learners. This program was a structured English immersion program. Implications: Proposition 58 was introduced and passed in 2016. This made it clear that districts had to have dual language immersion programs for native and non-native students. And this also protected the rights of the parents so that they could select classes that were best suited for their child's needs. Limitations: the judge in this case didn't find anything persuasive when they first tried to repeal Proposition 227, and so he blocked it from taking effect, and it actually wasn't repealed until years later in 2016. And when the program Proposition 227 was in place, it typically didn't last more than a year before the child was no longer in the program.
Proposition 203 in 2000, and its key points are: this law requires that all children in Arizona public schools shall be placed in English language classrooms, even if they don't know English. Arizona remains the only state with English-only education legislation still in effect as of 2023. Their graduation rates are nearly 20% below the national average, while their standardized test scores fall far below those of the state's general population. Its implications are, from what I've researched, this law is ineffective and that there are no pros to this act being passed, in my opinion. The graduation rate in Arizona is lower, and as diverse as this country is, it should be our responsibility to accommodate for emergent bilinguals no matter what. Its limitations are that this act limits the type of instruction available to English language learners and emergent bilingual students in Arizona and does not accommodate for the native speakers whatsoever in the public generalized classroom.
Next up, we have the No Child Left Behind Act, and this took place in 2001. Its key points is that the No Child Left Behind Act appropriated funds to the states rather than federal funds in order to help improve and enhance the education of English learners. It helped assist students and children to learn the English language, and students were worked with diligently to meet the state's challenging academic standards and content. Its implication is that an advantage of the act was that teaching and learning was focused more towards a variety of students, such as the ones that are in poverty, the ones of color, receiving special education services, and English language learners and emergent bilinguals. Its limitations is that, yes, it held schools more accountable for student achievement through annual testing and annual reporting in order to strengthen any weak areas of performance. However, many teachers and parents, especially of special education and English language learners, addressed concerns that the act was focused more centrally on students' test scores rather than the content and skills the students were actually learning.
Americans with Disabilities Act Amendment in 2008, and its key points are: the law made a number of significant changes to the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act definition of disability, to ensure that it would be easier for individuals seeking the protection of the ADA to establish that they have a disability that falls within the meaning of the statute. It will be easier for individuals to establish coverage under the regarded as prong of the definition of disability. The law was intended to clarify the scope of the definition of disability under the ADA. Its implications are: the Americans with Disabilities Act Amendment added additional guidance for special education in public and secondary schools. And its limitations are, even years after the Americans with Disabilities Act amendment was passed, many districts have yet to completely adopt its changes or conduct reviews of health plans per revised Section 504 eligibility criteria.
And then we have the Every Student Succeeds Act, and this was from 2015. Its key points is that the act was originally signed into law under the No Child Left Behind Act by Lyndon B. Johnson. And it was in order to distribute equal access to all students. And it was the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, also known as ESEA, replacing, like I said, the No Child Left Behind Act. It strengthened the equitable services and granted access to the state as well as district accountability for students. Its implications is that it encouraged higher standards of academics and goals from ELL and students from low-income families, parents, teachers, and administrators. And its limitations is that it had been designed to ensure that the federal government would always be present in the school system and advocate for public education, but the government input didn't always help educational goals be met.
Okay, that concludes our CAA number 3 historical timeline project. And here's our reference page where we got all of our information from. And thank you very much.